Napoleon Hill is once quoted as saying, "The starting point of all achievement is desire." Thank you all for having the desire to be here, and we're going to do our best to make this as informative as possible. This presentation on cybersecurity is being done in conjunction with the California Manufacturing Technology Consulting, the Coalition for Prosperous America, the Society of Manufacturing Engineers in San Diego, and the California Network for Manufacturing Innovation, and the Microsoft Community Connections Program. My name is Brian Inuma. My company is Strategic Systems Group. We're a Los Angeles-based IT consulting firm and experts in enterprise resource planning. We help manufacturing and logistics companies who are maybe 25 million to 150 million in revenue, who are frustrated by the lack of or insufficient internal IT resource, who are upset by systems implementation that didn't go so well, perhaps with another partner, who are under pressure to allocate too few resources to too many technical issues, and who are concerned about the return on investment of their ERP application. This presentation is being done in conjunction with the Microsoft Community Connections Program, and Eddie Bader and I are members of that association and are charged with providing education and thought leadership to chambers of commerce and business associations. And with that, I'd like to present our co-presenter for today, Mr. Eddie Bader.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. As Brian said, our company is company built, and we're an Orange County-based technology company that our work is focused on helping companies use technology to be more productive, more efficient, and secure their sensitive data. And we're looking forward to presenting to you some information on cybersecurity and how to prevent attacks and how to handle a situation if you think you've been compromised.
Thank you, Eddie. So here's our agenda for this presentation. So we've gone through our intros and background, and the main portion of our presentation is about mitigating risk. And then at the end, we'll have a short question and answer panel discussion. Computer crime or cybercrime is something that involves a computer or could even be a network. And unfortunately, the computer could be used as the target of a crime, or it could be used as a tool in the commission of a crime. Here are some statistics, and some of these are a little bit daunting. There's a 34% average increase in the financial losses from cybercrime in 2014. The average cost of a cybercrime is a little bit over $20,000. 40% of businesses hit by cybercrime close within 6 months. And the fines that relate to these are increasing. There's a legal and a privacy obligation at the state and federal level, and those are where things get to be pretty expensive. There are also some fines that are imposed by the credit card companies whenever credit card data is lost. In the news, there have been quite a few recent data breaches. The one from Target is the one that's sort of fresh in people's mind as being a big one. And then Eddie has a couple more that he'd like to mention at this point.
Sure, Brian. A lot of people, when they talk about the Target issue, they think it might have been an issue with Target per se, but it was actually the fact that they went into a third-party vendor who was doing the HVAC for Target, and they got access to Target's information via that third-party vendor. So remember when, a couple of slides ago, when Brian was talking about that the computer could be the target or it could be used in the commission of a crime. This was a case in point where it was used in the commission of the crime. So there's actually two breaches. There was a breach at the third-party vendor, the HVAC vendor, and then that led to the eventual Target breach, which was Target. So it's very interesting. A lot of small businesses think that they're really safe because they don't have any information that's of interest to hackers or would-be data thieves, but you have to think beyond your own walls and think of who you have access to or who you deal with on a regular basis, because you might be used as an entry point to any of those organizations. The other one that I wanted to bring up too was the breaches with Yahoo that we found out at the end of last year. One was detailed in September, and then 2 more were detailed in December. And if you're aware, Verizon had put a bid in to purchase Yahoo, and they just recently, as of a couple of weeks ago, it was reported that they reduced the amount of that offer by $350 million based upon the issues related to these recent breaches. They also are putting the entire onus of the lawsuits by shareholders and any litigation that comes out of that whole breach, or those all 3 of those breaches, all that's going to be put on Yahoo financials so that Verizon doesn't have to share the burden of that cost. So these are pretty big things that are happening in the industry, and granted, these are multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar companies, but if you scale down, the impact to small businesses is significant. The 40% of businesses that close after a breach incident, that's a stat from FEMA, and it's very much a reality. So it's important that we secure our businesses and our intellectual property.
Great, thanks, Eddie. So how big is this problem? It's estimated that there were over 600 million records exposed from breaches in 2015, and employees are the company's biggest threat. A lot of times we talk about threats from the outside that are pretty tough to get through firewall technology. However, from the inside, the threat is actually much more prevalent. Staff and negligence will continue to be the leading causes of incidents in 2017, and the problem will only grow as the IoT or Internet of Things brings even more devices into the network. Owners and executives must see the problem as a business issue and not solely an IT issue. And it is definitely a business problem whenever a breach occurs, because the financial implications are significant. Small business is a prime target. And a lot of our discussion has been about large organizations and breaches that have occurred there, and those are the ones that you hear about in the news. But small business is also a prime target. And security by obscurity and denial is no longer an option. Criminals know that small businesses believe they are safe or will take their chances, which make them a better target and much more easy to tap into. IT is often in denial, budgets are stretched, and executives do not pay attention to the threats. I have one little story to tell about a credit card breach, and it had to do with a restaurant in the Midwest someplace. And the restaurant basically had a POS system that was not up to date, and quite a number of credit cards were actually stolen and used to create fraudulent charges. The financial implications of that particular incident got pretty close to $1 million. So, what do businesses do to plan for security? Eddie?
Thanks, Brian. So, in planning for security issues and to keep your company safe, you have to understand what your obligation as a business owner or business manager is. And largely that comes around protecting your data. And there's the concept of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When we talk about confidentiality, we're talking about things of the nature is to keep data secure and only available to those who need to work with it. So internally, your human resource information should only be available to those in human resources that need to see that. It shouldn't be made available to sales and marketing or the finance guys or anybody else for that matter. It's just common sense, but just to reiterate some of the obligations that we have around confidentiality of data. And that extends beyond your walls. So if you have to transmit any information regarding human resources, or I'm using that as an example, let's say it's social security number, health information, or whatever, it needs to be only given to those with a need, like the government or whoever you may be dealing with, but it's not open source information to share with everybody. Integrity of the data is actually discussing the quality of the data to make sure that all the entry is 100% accurate, to make sure that it's safe from being tampered with, both internally and externally, so that whenever this information is being used or shared, it's 100% accurate and there are no issues for the company or its employees. And lastly, with availability of your data, you have to make sure that the information is available to whoever needs it, with respect to the other two categories that we talked about, especially confidentiality. When the finance people need to get to their information, human resources, sales and marketing, whenever they need to access their data, it needs to be readily available. And it needs to be secure. And again, this is not only internally, but it's also externally for information that you're actually going to share with outside organizations. So let's say in the sense of you're a publicly traded company, if you're going to share financial information, it's really important going down this list that it's only shared with those who need to see it, that the information is 100% accurate, and that it's available when anybody who needs it comes calling, let's say the SEC or any other regulatory organization. They need to be able to get the information or get at your data whenever it's required. So moving on, when we plan for the inevitable, there's a lot of things that can happen. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that planning for a breach after a breach has happened is not planning at all. It's reacting. So you need to have a plan in place ahead of time so that you know what to do as an owner or manager, but also separate those larger tasks into smaller tasks for each of your department so they know how to respond in the event of a breach incident. So when we're developing a plan, we want to be mindful of creating a timely and proper response to what's going on. The processes and procedures need to be in place, and that will allow you to effectively respond to an incident, and then ensure all employees understand their obligations. So even down to the very basic user, if a breach has occurred, what's their process? What do they do? Do they stop working? Is there automatically reset of all their passwords so we can quote unquote cleanse the system? Is there a way for them to work offline? You have to come up with this whole operation and plan in the event of a breach. You may just say that, oh, we're just going to shut down completely until we figure out what's going on. But everybody needs to know what the plan is and what their piece of accomplishing that plan is before it happens. So you might be thinking, oh, that's a lot of work. Where do I start? I don't even know anything about this. You know, I have no idea where to begin. So the best place to start is by inventorying and classifying your systems, your data, your facilities, and your people. And you want to document this, and again, you want to make sure this is available to all the people that need access to it. So we're talking about, and we'll go into detail in all of these as we move along, but remember, there's going to be things that you do from a technology point, but when we get to facilities, we're also talking about physical access and physical security. So keep that in mind as we progress through this. So when we talk about inventorying systems, you want to determine all the systems that are most critical and actually have the most sensitive data in your company. These aren't just computers. They could be files. Let's say you have you keep some sensitive information in an Excel workbook or an Access database or even a Word document. You want to make sure that information is secure. Again, and at a whole other level, you want to make sure that only the people who need access to it have access to it. You should be assigning job functions to quantify and keep the systems updated. So you want to make sure that you assign somebody in a role to always verify that. It shouldn't always be you. You should be managing, if you're the owner or the manager, you should be managing this at a higher level, but you should have assigned somebody a specific job of checking this on a daily basis or a weekly basis, whatever interval seems appropriate for your particular organization. Again, you want to document your baseline configuration for all systems. And this is important because in the case of a breach where you have to rebuild from scratch, you're going to use this baseline configuration as the working document to get you back to where you need to be to get the business going again. So it's really important that you're very detailed with that document so that you know everything that needs to be up and running before the business can be back up and running. And lastly, identify critical vendors and support mechanisms. So in case of a breach, do you have IT on staff? If not, do you outsource that? Are they readily available? Do you have a contract with them that states that they'll come in, in an emergency situation? What does that look like? If this happens on the weekend or after hours, you want to make sure that you have access to these people and that they can support you in this effort to get your business back up and running. So it's important to not only identify the support that you have in place, but to make sure that the people in charge of implementing your plan have access to the contact information for those vendors and have access to those other support mechanisms. So when we talk about your data, a lot of our talks are focused around data. So you want to determine everywhere your data resides, and this could be on-premise, this could be in the cloud. If you have people that work remotely, this could be on their mobile devices. Hopefully it's not on their personal home devices, but if it is, you need to understand where that is and how to protect it as well. Again, you want to identify a person that's responsible for protecting this data, just as if you're, and it might be the same person that you assign to be responsible for the systems. Let's say you have a go-to person for human resources, and they take care of your systems and your data for all the human resources related issues. That's fine, but you just want to make sure that you have at least one person as a point of contact, or a responsible individual to handle issues in that department. And I would strongly recommend having a backup just in case that person may be out on vacation or out on business. Again, document access and permission. This is going to be a common theme for us in this discussion. Only people who need access should have access. There's really no point in having files that are completely accessible to everyone unless it's truly something that is company-wide or universal in nature, let's say like a W-4 or some other human resource form that in and of itself has no personally identifiable information, but that everybody would use. Once it's filled out, it becomes confidential and access-driven, but in its blank state, anybody can have access to it. So kind of keep that in mind as an example. And the last one here is learn of and protect any shadow IT processes and data. There's a certain amount of information that you know about in your organization. The things that you may not know about, let's say like people using Facebook or Pandora or their personal Dropbox to store files and things of that nature. That's what we refer to as shadow IT. All that technology that you are unaware of that has come inside the walls of your business, or potentially is being used outside the walls of your business when people are at home. Again, if they do work remotely, this is much more prevalent. What you need to do is you need to be able to understand what's being used, how it's being used, and how that affects your company. So now we move on to people, and I would say that the individuals who are your biggest asset are potentially your biggest risk as well. And not intentionally, although sometimes in cases, there are cases where it's intentional. But usually most breaches will be initiated by somebody in your company, whether they open an email that they shouldn't have, they download something that they shouldn't have. These happen to be the biggest targets. I think the number is still around 70% of all breaches are executed by some type of phishing email, where an email is sent, it looks like it's real business, or it looks like it's even coming from within, from somebody, an executive within the company, and somebody clicks on it or responds to it, and then boom, you either have a bank account that's compromised, or you have your network that's compromised. So there are ways to train for that. But again, we're going to focus on the people side because it's a big part of keeping your information secure. So when we talk about internal leadership, developing roles and responsibilities, it's important that everybody in your company realizes that cybersecurity is everybody's business. It's not just IT. It's not just the owner. It's not just the manager or president. Everybody who gets on a system or uses data for the company is responsible for securing it. Ensuring all individuals are prepared is really important. I just talked about how you can train your staff to look for emails that look suspicious and not respond to things that don't make sense. There's a story of an individual that received an email, and it came from the CEO's email address to a payables clerk saying, hey, can you transfer $100,000 to this account? I need it for this contract or whatever. And so the person went ahead and did it without even thinking to contact anybody else. They just transferred the money, and they lost it. It was a scam. Now, what you need to train your people to do is think about the processes that you have in place. Does the CEO really send an email to an accounts payable clerk requesting a $100,000 transfer? It just doesn't pass the eye test, right? There's usually a different process that person goes through. But the clerk being flattered that the CEO is contacting him or her, wanting to do a good job for that person and maybe get some recognition, they just go ahead and do something without really thinking it through. So you want to make sure that every position has clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and more importantly, work or process flow that outlines how work should get done. So that in this case, if you got an email like that, you would just automatically dismiss it because that's not how you process a transfer. And through that, you actually eliminate all these little weak links that could possibly compromise your company and your data. And lastly, don't go it alone. There are many different individuals or organizations that you could use to help you out in this. Legal counsel, public relations firms, insurance. There's insurance for cyber breaches. It's not that expensive, and it's pretty liberal on the coverage that they provide. Plus, they also provide extended coverage. So if you get breached, what does that mean to your clients? or to individuals transacting with you. You want to make sure your communications are positive and are really describing, well, let's say you get breached and there's a concern about that. You want to make sure that you're over communicating, not only about the incident, but about what you're doing to get on top of it, and more importantly, to prevent it from happening in the future. You always want to look for a technology consultant. Hopefully you have one, but if you don't, you want to make sure that you have somebody who's helping you prevent this from happening in the first place, or at least helping you mitigate the issues that result from a breach. And now we're talking about facilities. So identify all the facilities that are owned by the company, possessed, or related to the organization in any way. It could be all in one location, different buildings. It could just be a small office. It could be a multitude of different combinations. Again, you want to remember that office, home, and other locations, whether that be of the president, of the manager, or of any individual that does work for the company outside of the four walls, you want to understand what that area looks like and how information is being stored in those areas. Identify the owners, so managers and users of these facilities. Again, could be the same people that we had outlined before, but perhaps not. Maybe you have a facilities manager, maybe you have a security manager, and those individuals are going to actually be responsible for physical security, who has access to what. And again, restrict who has access and under what circumstances. So if you have a server on site, it should be in a room, well ventilated, and it should not be accessible by everyone. So it should be behind a locked door, and the people who have access to it should be very limited. So if you have an IT group, then maybe that group has access to it. The general manager or the owner has access to it, but it shouldn't be everybody. And I would say fewer is better. That way you can control who's actually going in there and looking around or doing things. If it needs to be cleaned, I would say that particular activity should be monitored in some fashion, but the door can't be unlocked and then left unguarded and have those people do what they're going to do and then somebody come back sometime later and lock the door again. That's pretty much no security at all. So physical security is really important. You can do that in a lot of different ways. You can do that with traditional key locks. You can do that with access cards, which is a great way to provide physical security and identification. Plus, it can also be used to gain access to their workstations, which is another way to secure your data. These access cards will not let somebody log into a machine that doesn't possess the card, so that's something to keep in mind as well.
Let's talk about regulations for a little bit. And in many cases, regulations from federal and state authorities apply. For example, Hipaa and PCI. The obligations for these things are a little bit more strenuous than just for the normal business who doesn't have non-public information. There's a need to coordinate defense to make sure it doesn't happen, and then a response in case it does happen. And oftentimes it's the response that is the more onerous of the tasks that need to be completed as a result of a breach. The procedure to document all instances should be prepared ahead of time so that when an incident does occur, it's just a matter of taking out the procedure document and following it to do all the forensic research and to notify appropriate personnel and authorities. And the last bit of advice here is for preparation ahead of time. As Eddie mentioned, a lot of times when a breach occurs, it's too late to prepare. So the time to prepare is before a breach occurs. Here are some examples of some incidents, and they're not necessarily meant to describe specific incidents, but more classifications of incidents. So this term hacktivism is kind of interesting process where someone who has an agenda or a bias against a certain type of industry or a certain type of company or the government for that matter would use hacking as a way to express themselves. There's going to be authorized use or disclosure of information, and one of the more insidious types is situations where the date of birth, social security number, name and address are all disclosed. There's a risk of theft or loss of equipment, and sometimes we talk about fire, flood, and theft as being situations where a breach could occur. One incident or one situation that we know of is a man who does accounting for a living, and if someone were to walk into his office and take all of his computer equipment, quite a number of things would get lost, including the data that relates to his clients. Denial of service is something that we see fairly frequently, and the denial of service is typically a situation where many devices across the internet are all making requests of a particular service, and the service can't keep up with those requests and it essentially shuts down. We all have been exposed to malicious code in the form of viruses, malware, and ransomware. And sometimes that sort of thing is also insidious in the sense that it looks like a regular piece of email, but in fact contains some code that will actually do some things not only to the local system but to the network as well. And then we talked about network or system application failures. So sometimes it's a situation where it's an individual computer. It could also be a network. It could also be something that impacts the software that's running on the network. And those sorts of failures sometimes are a little bit more troublesome because the application can actually work to send out a significant volume of data undetected.
So what if you're breached? How do you respond to incidents? And really that's all about how you discover them. So when we talk about this, an event that has potential to adversely impact the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of any corporate resource, an investigation is in the process of analyzing an incident, and a breach means protected data was compromised. So I think we all understand what that means. The important thing to understand is you may get breached and you may not know about it for quite some time. So there's some things we call breach indicators. There'll be a noticeable compromise of custody and control. You may not have access to all the information you had access to before. You may be accessing it and you'll notice that things have changed. Maybe there's an issue with the integrity of the data now. Something's different than the way it looked before. Little signs, maybe subtle, only maybe noticeable to somebody who uses that information on a regular basis or accesses those applications. And again, that's something that you should think about when determining who's responsible in your group for each of these systems and the data. It's much more relevant to have somebody that uses those applications and data on a regular basis be responsible for them, because they're going to understand the minor nuances from day to day, and if something looks out of sorts, they're the ones that are most likely going to be able to pick up on that quicker than anybody else. So it's important that you use those subject matter experts in each of your divisions or groups within your company. IT systems access or malware activity. Again, when we talked about creating a baseline configuration, there's actually a baseline of network activity. There are things that when you look at it, even from a very clinical perspective, there's a way that your business runs every day. and just monitoring that traffic, monitoring the IP addresses that are coming in and going out. You get a feel for what your business looks like. It's, it's healthy, the way it runs in a healthy state. If you start monitoring the information and the network activity, you'll be able to pick up anomalies that say, hey, all of a sudden we're sending a lot of information to this IP address that we never used to send it to before. What is that? And you might find that that's actually in Russia or overseas somewhere. And that's actually most likely somebody stealing your data at that point. But if you don't create that baseline and if you don't monitor it going forward, you wouldn't be able to pick up on those differences. And again, for SMBs, and to be quite honest, even for large companies, the average time to detection is close to 18 months. On a minimum side, unless they're really on top of it, even the minimum side can be a couple weeks to up to 4 months before they first find it. And then it's a matter of, how long has it been, how much have they accessed. In 2 weeks, a hacker can get into quite a bit of your system. So you're just finding out that they're there. You don't know what they've done while they've been there, what they've accessed, what else they've left. They might have opened up some back doors for them to get back into your system if you find the original breach. So just keep that in mind. I liken this to, let's say your security at your house. You're going to have an alarm system if somebody breaks through the front door or breaks through the back window. You can set that up. But let's say somebody picks the lock and doesn't set off the alarm, and now they're walking inside your house. Do you have any system that is going to be, searching the house and looking for those intruders? In the case of a house, maybe it's a couple of huge dogs with, not so nice disposition. But in the technology world, you have other applications and other activity trackers that can look for this kind of breach. So they might not detect the intrusion, but they'll be looking for activity within the system, and that identifies the intrusion that happened before. So just keep that in mind. It's a very layered approach. You want to keep them out if you can, but understanding that if they want to get in, they probably will be able to. So you need to be constantly scanning your network to make sure you can find those anomalies within your system. So immediate steps: if you suspect a data breach has occurred, you should contact a cybersecurity specialist. Ideally, this is not going to be the first time you talk to this person. Ideally, you're already working with a technology advisor. Again, these extensions of your company that we talked about before, legal counsel, PR, media, technology, and so on. Hopefully, you already have this this relationship established, and they're monitoring things. And if they're doing a good job, hopefully they contact you prior to you contacting them, because they've noticed some activity. So they'll initiate the response plan. That's perfect situation. Outside of perfect situation being that you don't get compromised at all, the perfect situation is that your technology advisor actually initiates the response plan, contacts you and says, hey, we're seeing activity. There might be something wrong. Let's start working through these steps. And you kind of go from there. And we'll talk about more people to contact in the next slide. So law enforcement is here to help. And Brian spoke of the PCI compliance, credit cards. Whenever there's a breach there, it's actually the Secret Service that gets involved and investigates those situations. So you're talking about things happening on the federal government agency level. I will tell you that I don't think there is a law enforcement organization that isn't willing to help you if there's been a breach. So I would say you want to contact your technology advisor first, and they can determine whether or not you should contact law enforcement. I would say it's never a bad idea to contact them and let them know what's going on, because if this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, maybe you can get some information to them and they can start sharing that with other local agencies, and they can get the word out to other businesses that, hey, it looks like there's an attack in this area or this industry, start looking for it. So I think that's it's never a bad call to get them on board. But again, work with your people, whether it's your internal people or your trusted advisors. Work with them and come up with that plan, or come up with those action items. And again, excuse me, that should be part of your response plan to begin with. So when we talk about security options for small businesses, there are different devices, different setups, different techniques for addressing this issue. One approach is to prevent it. One approach is to realize that you want to prevent as much as you can, but the actuality of somebody getting in just depends on how serious they are about getting into your system. So you should have a means to back up and restore in case of an issue like CryptoLocker, where they come in, they copy all your files, they encrypt those files, and then they delete the originals, and then they put a nice little message on your screen that says, hey, you've been compromised, we have all your files locked. If you want to have access to those again, you need to pay us X amount of dollars. If you had a backup system that did like intraday snapshots, then you can just restore to a point before the breach and begin working again as if there had never been a breach there before. So there's a lot of different solutions, and each solution has a cost associated with it. So you have to think about a few things. You have to think about what kind of budget you have to put towards this, and what your tolerance level for potentially being out of business for, are we talking hours or days or weeks? How much can your business actually tolerate? So that will bring you to the right decision, and you should be making those decisions with your team, which includes your external trusted advisors. Microsoft has a great solution called EMS, which stands for Enterprise Mobility and Security. It's a package that gets added on to Office 365, and it's a whole new layer of security for your organization. What's really nice about that is that even if you don't have EMS and you just have Office 365, you can go to a site, and I believe it's securescore.microsoft.com, and you can type in your credentials. It'll actually rate you as far as it has a scoring system. It'll show you your score as far as how well you're doing on securing your data and your domain and things like that. And then it gives you tips on what you can add and how much this will improve your score, and you can use that. And it's very simple. It's drop-down boxes. It tells you not only what it is, how it's going to help, but it shows you where to go to turn these things on, and it's really quite thorough. And depending on how your organization is set up, you have different options. So you could go to it, other companies could go to it, and it will provide different information for each of you because your companies are set up differently. But it's a nice way to kind of self-manage your exposure, or to understand how well you're doing in keeping your information protected.
So in summary, there's quite a few things to be mindful of in terms of cybersecurity. And it's a concern for all businesses, not just for the largest businesses. Small and medium-sized businesses are targets as well. And the situation is, unfortunately, that's a lot of times small businesses don't have the same sort of resources that large ones do in terms of protecting themselves. There are obligations that range from confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of the data. It's important to make employees aware of the threats, and as we kind of discussed before, attack from the outside oftentimes is difficult to get in, but attack from the inside is actually much easier. Develop a relationship with a cybersecurity expert, and as Eddie mentioned, try and do that ahead of time as opposed to after. And complacency and procrastination are not your friends. It's time to be proactive. As far as next steps go, define a path for success, work with a trusted advisor, and then select the right technology. So EMS, as Eddie mentioned before, is an example of that. To support your plan, implement, and then every so often periodically verify to make sure that the plan is sound. The goal is to create some peace of mind. We have time for a couple of questions, and we'll just do a kind of a quick panel discussion. And one of the things that came to mind that was direct impact to me was I received a letter from Anthem, Blue Cross, and also from UCLA Health. So Anthem, Blue Cross is an insurer, and the UCLA Health is a provider of healthcare. So in this situation, apparently they were breached. And Eddie, what is the implication of a company like that or companies like that getting breached as opposed to a small business?
Okay, well, that's a great question. I think primarily because health records and health record IDs are very hot right now on the black market. So if they can get into a company like that and they can get that health information, what they do is they sell it, and the ripple effect of that is that somebody can be using your health number to get services done for themselves. They can be getting surgeries, they can be getting treatment, they can be getting all these different types of things, and all that can be racked up against your account, and then either you run out of benefits or you're getting sent a bill for procedures that you never had performed. It's huge. The health industry specifically, not only to mention that you have Hipaa regulations, but you also have the exposure of that medical data. Just on a side note, any medical office that's using printers or copiers or scanners, typically all of those are equipped with a hard disk drive. Many of those are leased in those medical offices. If those hard drives aren't removed and destroyed upon termination of the lease, or when they get exchanged out, or before they get thrown away if they're owned, somebody can go in, remove those hard drives, and access all that data that's been scanned, which is going to have medical records, most likely social security numbers, and a host of other information that can be compromised and adversely affected. I would hate to imagine what the average cost per affected record is for these individuals, but I'm sure it's quite staggering.
Great, thanks. One of the things that I think is sort of insidious or troublesome with health records is that date of birth oftentimes is there, social security numbers are often there, names and addresses as well. And I guess in the case of a medical office or a provider, the provider might also have some credit card data as well. So the potential of data loss or the implications of data loss in those situations is significant. I have a question that relates to email, Eddie. So sometimes email gets sent back and forth, and sometimes it has some non-public information in it. So what do you suggest for people who are sending email with some data like that?
The short answer is to use encryption. So when we talk about encryption, if you're not familiar with that term, it's It's the difference between sending something in plain text, which means we're looking at this slide right now and it says Q&A panel discussion. If I were to send that in an email in plain text and that packet was snatched and somebody retrieved that information, all I'd have to do is open it up and they would see exactly what we're seeing now. Q&A and panel discussion, Microsoft logo, all that. If you encrypt it, it pretty much jumbles this whole message. So that's, if they were to get it and open it up, it looks like gibberish. It's, you know, hashtags, exclamation points, all. You'd have to have basically a decoder ring, the encryption key, to unencrypt this information so that you can read it. And without that, it's pretty much useless to the person that stole it. And there's two types of encryption. So encryption at rest is data that's on a hard drive sitting on your computer. You want to make sure when that's there that hard drive is encrypted. Data in motion is what we're talking about right now, sending something via email. Ideally, you want to encrypt it before it goes, send it, and then give the receiver the encryption key so that they could decode the message on their end. You also want to kind of use that technique when you're storing information in the cloud whenever possible, is encrypt it so that on its way over to its final resting place, that it's encrypted from one end to the next, and then of course encrypted when it's at rest on the other side. So that's how I would solve that. Again, the EMS package that we talked about earlier can help you manage that process.
Great. And maybe our last question for today, it relates to the first things. So first things first. What should a small or medium-sized business consider first for cybersecurity?
Well, I would say that a good antivirus on all endpoints and servers is a great place to start. Passwords that are at least 9 characters or longer, and to make sure that those passwords aren't just written on a post-it note and stuck to the monitor. That's another, that's like a side benefit to that. Let's see, quick things that you can do. You can initiate multi-factor authentication. If you're not familiar with what that is, that's just a password that's considered a factor. So another factor could be where you're required to get a text code on your mobile device, or there's a key card that you have to put in along with the password to get into the system, or you can use a biometric, such as there are newer computers that use the camera function in the computer to identify face. So you can use facial recognition, you can use a thumbprint, you can use some other kind of biometric, but all those factors added together represent a more secure environment.
Great, thanks. On the slide here, there is an email address, slides@ssgnet.com. So if you would send email to that email address to request a copy of the slides, we'll send back to you a PDF version of today's presentation. Also, since we are part of the Microsoft Community Connections program, Microsoft provides to us licenses for Office 2016 that we'll give away as a raffle prize for anybody who submits email to slides@ssgnet.com. Then in the subject or the body of the email message, go ahead and put in the word cybersecurity so that we know that it was from today's presentation. Eddie, do you have any last thoughts before we conclude?
I'll just say that I think the best place to get started is to do something. I think we have a list of like 5 tips on where to get started. We can send that along with the slides if they're interested. Having a internet and technology use policy that's signed by every person in your company, I think that's also important. But the best thing to do is to do something. So get started and really have that plan in place. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for attending.
And for me also, just to want to thank everybody who attended the presentation, and know that your time is valuable, and we hope that this was informative for you. Thanks, and have a great day.